The first time I visited the factory, I wasn't there for a tour or a job interview. I was there to collect my father's things. He had collapsed the day before heart attack, sudden and final. One moment he was welding steel, the next, on the cold concrete floor of Bay 4. No warnings, no goodbyes, no goodbyes. My name is Lucas Patel. I was 25, working a temp admin job in Milwaukee. And until I got that phone call, I hadn't spoken to my father in nearly 5 years. The man was a mystery even to those who claimed to know him. He worked for Henderson Steelworks for nearly 30 years, never missed a shift, never called in sick. People said he could spot a hairline fracture in a beam from 30 paces, but he couldn't hold a conversation that lasted more than 3 minutes with his only son. I stood outside the factory gates in the early morning, clutching a cardboard badge they'd printed for me at the front desk. The air smelled of iron, filings and stale coffee. I hadn't expected the place to look so ordinary. A supervisor named Denise met me at the front office. She was kind but nervous, like she wasn't sure how much I already knew. We packed up his locker, she said, leading me through rows of humming machines and high-vis jackets. He didn't have much in there, just personal effects. Nodded silently. What was there to say? The locker was dull blue and dented in the corner. Inside, a pair of worn work boots, a rusted thermos, and a faded Polaroid of me when I was 10, grinning at a school science fair I hadn't even known. He kept a picture of me. Tucked behind the photo was a yellowed envelope. My name was scrawled across the front in blocky handwriting I hadn't seen since high school. Just Lucas. No son, no love, dad, just a name, like on a utility bill. I took it without a word, shoved the rest of the items into a duffel bag, and left. Back at my apartment, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the envelope. There was no return address, no date. I turned it over 3 times before opening it. The paper inside was folded neatly into thirds. Lucas, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. That means the factory gave you my things. They weren't much, but they were mine. Like the life I built. Quiet, plain, but mine. I know we haven't spoken. That's my fault. You tried, and I didn't make space. I want to tell you why, even if I never got the courage to do it face to face. Your mum left when you were 11, you know that part. What you don't know is that she asked me to come with her. I said no. Not because I didn't love her, but because I thought keeping you in the only home you'd ever known was the right thing. I thought stability was better than honesty. Maybe I was wrong. You were always smarter than me, and kinder. You deserved better than a father who didn't know how to talk to his own kid. But I never stopped thinking about you, Dad. I read it twice. Then again, the words blurred. He had never talked about her, not once. After the day she disappeared with 3 bags and a cab ride, it was like she had never existed. I learned early not to ask. He'd shut down, his mouth flattening into a single unreadable line. I thought she had left both of us, but she hadn't. She had invited him, and he had refused. 1,000 memories crashed into me at once. The awkward dinners, the birthdays spent in silence, the time I broke my wrist at soccer practice and he sat in the ER flipping through a magazine without once asking if I was okay. He hadn't been cruel, he'd just been ... absent, emotionally unreachable. A ghost that kept the lights on and paid for groceries. And now he was telling me that all of it, every distant moment, was a choice. I put the letter back in the envelope and slipped it into the drawer of my nightstand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing him alone in that factory locker room, stuffing a letter behind a photo like some kind of posthumous confession. What did he expect? That I'd cry, that I'd forgive him, that I'd suddenly understand the decades of silence. I wanted to be angry, but I wasn't. I just felt hollowed. On the next morning, I drove back to Henderson Steelworks. Denise was surprised to see me. Is everything okay? Yeah, I lied. I just... was wondering if anyone here knew him well, like, personally. She hesitated. Honestly, your dad didn't talk much. Came in early, left on time, ate lunch alone. That sounded about right. But there was this guy, she added, Doug Hernandez. Worked in Bay 2. They sometimes carpooled. She gave me Doug's number, and I called him from the parking lot. Doug answered on the second ring. Hello? Hi. This is Lucas Patel. My father was Olok. Yay, I'm sorry, kid. Thanks. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about him, anything I might not know. There was a pause. Meet me at the Rusty Anchor around 5. It's a bar off 8th. Hard to explain over the phone. Asterisk. The Rusty Anchor looked exactly how it sounded, dim, dusty, and held together by the smell of stale beer and linoleum flooring. A closed Mondays sign hung permanently crooked on the glass door. Even though today was Thursday. Doug Hernandez was already there when I walked in, late 50s, heavy denim jacket, hands that looked like they hadn't known rest since the Reagan era. He nodded when he saw me. "You're Alex boy," he said. Not a question. I slid into the booth. "That's me." He waved to the bartender for 2 coffees. "No pleasantries. I worked with your dad 23 years. Doug said he once welded a crane beam during a windstorm. Most guys would have walked off the job. He didn't blink. Quietest man I've ever met, but solid." "That sounds like him," I said, stirring my coffee out of habit. I didn't drink it black, but Doug had ordered it that way for both of us. He didn't talk about family. Doug went on, didn't talk about much, but the last year or so he started asking questions. I looked up. "What kind of questions?" "Books," he said. "Classes, schools." Asked me if I knew anything about scholarships or online courses. Thought maybe I was a secret academic. "Why would he ask you that?" Doug smiled faintly. "Because he didn't want to ask you." I blinked. "What are you saying?" "I think your old man wanted to connect with you," Doug said, "but he didn't know how. Maybe he thought if he learned what interested you, he could fake his way into a conversation." I sat back in the booth, stunned. My dad, asking about books. Doug sipped his coffee. "I told him to just call you. Be honest. You know what he said?" "What?" Doug shrugged. "Not yet." That was all. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Then he reached into his coat and slid something across the table, a beat-up paperback. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He underlined some things in the margins. Doug said you liked this one. I picked up the book. It was mine. I'd lost it during a visit home my sophomore year. I always assumed it got tossed. He kept it in his locker, Doug added. Said it reminded him of you. A sharp knot formed in my throat. I ran my hand over the dog-eared cover. There, scribbled in the margin beside a quote about system bias, were the initials AP in his familiar block print. He read my books. He underlined my notes. He carried them to work. He didn't say much, Doug said softly, but he noticed things. He carried a lot more than he let on. After I left the bar, I sat in my car for a long time just staring at that book. For years, I'd believed my father didn't care, that he had chosen silence over relationship, duty over warmth. But now I was beginning to wonder if maybe he had just chosen differently, not better or worse, just from behind the thick wall of fear and habits he didn't know how to dismantle. Was that love? Not the kind I understood, not the kind you see in movies, but maybe something smaller, quieter, no parades, no speeches, just a man reading his son's college book by flashlight in a locker room and hoping it meant something. Over the next few days I went through the rest of his things. His apartment was a 1-bedroom on the east side, beige carpets, thin walls, and a fridge stocked with bottled water and leftover dole. He'd lived simply. No TV, just an old radio and shelves of books I never knew he owned. Technical manuals, welding guides, but also poetry, Neruda, Tagore, even Whitman, stuffed under a pile of car magazines. There were notes, dozens of them. He had filled 2 spiral notebooks with lists, ideas and questions, all written in his clunky handwriting. At first glance, they looked like shopping lists, but when I looked closer, I realized what they were. Questions for me. What does Lucas do in finance? Is it math-heavy? What's the difference between LLC and S-Corp? Books Lucas likes: behavioral econ, decision theory, human bias. He had been studying me. One line stopped me cold. Call him before his birthday this year. Ask how he's really doing. It was dated 2 years ago. He never made the call. I didn't cry. Not then. Not yet. But the silence in that apartment felt heavier than I'd ever known. I found a sealed envelope, taped to the back of the door, on the front, to be opened if I'm gone. Inside, a list of instructions, accounts, passwords, his small pension, balance, a list of old friends to call. At the bottom, a single line: tell Lucas I'm proud of him, even when I didn't know how to show it. I went back to Milwaukee, but something had changed. I started noticing things, little habits I'd inherited from him, folding socks a certain way, tapping the steering wheel when thinking, flipping through books from the back cover forward. Things I had once dismissed as quirks now looked like clues. That weekend I visited my mum for the first time in over a year. She remarried when I was 19. We'd drifted, but now I needed answers. Did he ever talk about me? I asked. She raised her eyebrows. Lucas, your father used to call me once a month, just to ask what you were reading. I stared at her. He never called me. She smiled sadly, because he didn't think he deserved to. I stayed with my mum that night. Not because I needed to. I had my apartment back in Milwaukee. and work was waiting, but because it felt like something unfinished had reopened, like a part of me that had been bricked off was finally asking to be seen. In the morning, she brought out a small wooden box from the hall closet. "He sent this to me 3 years ago," she said. "Told me not to give it to you unless something happened to him." Inside was a collection of odd items, a pair of tiny steel dice, a newspaper clipping from my middle school science fair, a faded photo of the two of us standing next to a Lego robot, and a black USB drive. There was no note, no explanation. "What's this?" I asked, holding the drive. She shrugged. "He never said. Just told me to keep it safe." I plugged it into my laptop. There was a single folder titled L_projects. Inside, dozens of files, PDFs, spreadsheets, schematics. At first glance, I thought it was old factory documentation, maybe safety manuals or training materials. But then I opened one. It wasn't for the factory. It was a full business proposal, a design for a modular, pre-assembled small footprint housing unit, something that could be flat-packed and transported to remote areas, titled Shelter, a system for those starting over. Blueprints, supplier lists, material breakdowns, all itemized with stunning precision. And at the bottom of the pitch, under proposed founder and operator, was my name, Lucas Patel. I sat frozen for a moment, then opened more documents. There were notes written in his voice. Lucas would need to handle logistics, partner with city programs or NGOs, start small, prototype first, use inheritance funds to launch initial run. What if this became something we built together? He had written those words 4 years ago. 4 years ago, when I thought he barely noticed I existed. When I thought he'd written me off as a disappointment. He had been building something in silence, not just a product, but a future he hoped to share, a future we never talked about. I leaned back in the chair, my heart racing, not with excitement, with grief. He had built a plan around a version of me I didn't even know he saw. Back in Milwaukee, I started reading every page. On that drive, night after night, after work on weekends, between emails and phone calls, I printed the materials out, marked them up, studied them like exam prep. The design was rough but viable. He had used scrap materials and warehouse offcuts for prototypes. He'd even outlined a budget using his life savings, $18,000 in a community bank account I'd never known about, labeled only as Lucas Dev. The shelters weren't just blueprints. They were an idea, a bridge, a way to take his skills, welding, construction, systems thinking, and use them to help people start over. And somehow, in the margins of all that, was me. He hadn't told me any of this, never showed me the plans. Never even hinted, but maybe he'd been planning to. Maybe the letter in the locker had been a first step. I reached out to Doug again, asked if he remembered my dad working on anything outside the factory. "Oh yeah," he said over the phone. He was always scribbling on lunch breaks. Said he had an escape hatch idea. That's what he called it. Never told me what it was though. Did anyone else know? Doug hesitated. "Maybe Jaya. She used to work in payroll, retired last year. Your dad trusted her. Used to ask her to scan stuff. I think she even helped him type things sometimes." I tracked down her number and called. She remembered me. "Oh Lucas, he talked about you more than you think." I asked if she still had any of the files he might have asked her to scan. "Check your email," she said. "I'm forwarding everything." The files arrived 5 minutes later. Higher resolution scans of notebook pages, early design drafts, even email exchanges with a local metalwork supplier. There was one message with a subject line, Lucas launch timeline, and a short note. "I don't know if he'll ever see this, but I want him to have something that's his, something we made." That night, I sat at my desk until sunrise. I wasn't sure what I was doing. I had no background in architecture, no training in product development. I worked in admin and data entry. My biggest responsibility was correcting invoice errors. But the materials were all here. The vision was here. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had inherited something that actually meant something. Not just money, not just memories, but a purpose, unfinished, but waiting. I called a friend from college who worked in logistics, told him about the idea. He said it was crazy, but interesting. "You'll need permits, prototypes, zoning approvals, but it's not impossible." I didn't want to launch a business just to honor my father. I wanted to see if maybe, just maybe, he had left behind something bigger than both of us. I applied for a small business grant from the state, filed paperwork for a pilot nonprofit, reached out to a local shelter director to pitch the idea. I told them I didn't have a finished product. Just a blueprint from a dead father who had spent 30 years welding steel and dreaming of something more. They said they'd listen. That was all I needed. I spent the next 3 months assembling a prototype in my garage with the help of 2 interns from a local tech school and a welder I hired part-time. We used salvaged parts. I watched YouTube tutorials on weatherproofing, screwed up the insulation twice, but by April it stood, a 10x10 shelter, foldable, transportable, built to last. No luxury, just dignity. And on the inside wall, behind the reinforced door, I welded a small metal plate with 2 words etched into it. LP. Asterisk. I didn't hold a press conference or post about it online. No ribbon cutting, no fanfare. I just invited one person, a caseworker from the east side shelter, to come see the prototype. She arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, clipboard in hand and doubt written across her face. By the time she stepped inside the shelter and ran her fingers across the insulated walls, her eyes softened. Simple, she said, but it's smart, functional, safe. That was all I wanted to hear. Within a month, she called back. We'd like to pilot 3 units. We have space behind the rec building. You'd need to transport and set them up. Can you handle that? I hesitated, and then I lied. Absolutely. I called in every favor I had, pulled overtime at my job to fund extra materials, reached out to a welding instructor at the tech college, convinced my landlord to let me use the lot behind our building for staging. It took 4 weeks to build 3 shelters, 4 weeks of measuring twice, cutting once, and watching YouTube videos on cold weather sealants at 3 a.m. Doug came by once, holding a sack of fasteners and a thermos. He'd be proud, you know, he said, nodding toward the nearly finished frame. Quiet, proud, but proud. I didn't answer because I didn't know yet how I felt. I was building a future my dad had imagined, yes, but I was also grieving for everything he hadn't done. For the 5 years we lost in silence. For the birthdays, the phone calls, the chance to have him by my side right now. Sometimes the noise of a drill was the only thing that kept me from crying. When we delivered the shelters, the crew at the shelter clapped. It was awkward and strange, like I'd won a prize I didn't know I was eligible for. One of the residents, a man maybe in his 40s, stepped inside and said, "This doesn't feel like charity. It feels like ... a reset." I thought about what my father had written on that blueprint folder, a system for those starting over. That night, I went home and opened the last sealed document on the USB drive. It was titled simply, "If Lucas keeps going." It was a roadmap. Outlined phases, unit upgrades, solar panel integration, even potential city partnership contacts. At the end, a paragraph. "If he decides this matters, I believe he can make it work. I've done what I can, now it's up to him." That broke me. I sat on the kitchen floor and cried harder than I had in years. Not because of what I had found, but because he had believed in a version of me I wasn't sure existed. I called my mum the next day. "I want you to see something," I said. She came out on a Sunday, walked the lot where the new units were being prepped for assembly. When she stepped into the 2nd-generation prototype, taller ceiling, reinforced panels, a battery-powered fan system, she covered her mouth and whispered, "He'd have loved this. He built this idea." I said, "I just finished it." She shook her head gently. "No, he planted a seed. You're the one growing it." We went to dinner that night, just the 2 of us, and for the first time in our lives, I told her, was proud of her too, for staying, for holding on, for carrying the parts of my father that he couldn't carry for himself. She cried. We didn't talk about it again. We didn't need to. Months passed. The shelters multiplied. We built 8, then 12. A donor came forward, a woman whose brother had lived on the streets for 2 years before finding a job and stability. She funded 20 more. The city called, said they were interested in a long-term plan. I filed for 501c3 status. I quit my admin job, and just like that, I was building something real, something lasting, something I would never have believed possible 2 years earlier. At night, when the work was done, I sometimes returned to the first shelter, the one I built by hand. I'd sit on the cot and stare at the small plate with his initials, and I'd wonder if this was what he meant when he said he wanted to leave something behind. He never asked me to forgive him, not directly, but maybe this was his way of asking, and maybe I was finally ready to say yes. Then one day, something strange happened. I received a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside, a folded page and a single black and white photograph. My father and me years ago. I was maybe 6, sitting on his shoulders at a construction site, both of us smiling like the world hadn't yet learned how to hurt us. The letter was Typed, "Dear Lucas, you don't know me, but I worked with your father years ago. He used to talk about you all the time, though he never said much. Said he didn't want to jinx things by bragging, but I thought you should know something. A few years ago we worked a job together out west. Long hours, bad weather, but solid pay. Every Friday your dad would take a chunk of his check and put it into a shoebox. Said it was for you. He said one day he's gonna build something big. I just want to make sure he gets the start I never had. I thought he meant college, but now, I think maybe he meant this. Anyway, I just wanted you to know he believed in you before you ever believed in yourself. Take care of what you're building. I think it matters more than you know. I folded the letter carefully and added it to the box in my closet, the one that holds his notebook, the old Polaroid, and the paperback he once underlined, the one labeled Dad. The non-profit became something larger than I ever imagined. We called it Restart Structures, based on a phrase I found scribbled in the corner of my dad's old notebook. Restart isn't failure, it's a structure. Stronger next time. By the end of the second year, we had over 60 units across 3 cities. We partnered with community centers, shelters, and eventually the VA. Our model wasn't flashy, it was small, modular, repairable, but it was enough to give someone a door to close, a roof that didn't leak, and a bed that wasn't a park bench. And that changes everything. The people we helped weren't numbers. They were former teachers, veterans, construction workers, single parents, kids who aged out of foster care. They'd sit on the wooden benches built into the shelters and talk about plans. Small ones, at first. Fixing their bikes, applying for getting clean. But then something bigger. Hope, the kind you can't buy or fake. And every time I handed over the keys to a new resident, I'd think of the silence my father lived in and the voice he left behind, not the man who didn't return. My call's not the one who skipped birthdays or never showed up to parent-teacher night, but the one who, quietly, in his own quiet way, chose to build something for me, with me, even without me. One afternoon, I was walking through a new site in St. Louis when I noticed a boy about 10 years old sitting on the steps of one of the units. He was scribbling something on a piece of cardboard with a blunt pencil. I asked if he needed anything. He looked up. Nope, just writing. What are you writing? He turned the cardboard around and showed me. It said, "This is going to be my first story." I smiled. That's a good place to start. He nodded like an adult would, like he'd been waiting his whole life to begin. I thought about my father's letter, the one he left in the locker, and how it wasn't polished or poetic, but it was honest, and it was enough. That boy had his pencil. My dad had his welder's hands. I had blueprints and unfinished sentences. Maybe we all tell our stories differently. People often ask me, what changed? What made me go from a disengaged admin worker to a non-profit founder? They want a neat answer, a headline version. I usually just say, a letter, sometimes I add, and a blueprint. But the real answer is messier. What changed was understanding. Understanding that parents aren't heroes, they're just people, and people make flawed choices when they're scared, exhausted, or out of ideas. They fail to say what matters. They hide from what hurts, and sometimes they leave damage in their wake. But they also leave clues. Sometimes they leave notebooks and half-finished ideas. Sometimes they leave books underlined with your name in the margin. Sometimes they leave steel dice in a wooden box, because when they were young, that's all they owned. That's all they owned, that if you're lucky or maybe just paying attention, you get to pick those clues up and build something with them, not because it fixes the past, but because it gives you a future. 3 years after I found that first letter, I stood on a small stage at the Midwest Urban Housing Conference with a stack of index cards and shaking hands. We'd been nominated for an award in innovation. I wasn't there for trophies. I hate public speaking, but I knew what I needed to say. So I said this. My dad worked with steel for 30 years. He didn't write books. He didn't attend conferences. He never posted a thing on LinkedIn. But when he passed away, he left behind blueprints for something he never got to build. Something he hoped I would. He never said the words "I believe in you" out loud, but he left proof, and that proof was enough to change my life, and maybe someone else's too. So I guess this is my message to anyone sitting on an idea, design, a dream too quiet to say out loud. Even if it feels like no one is watching, someone is. And even if your hands are rough and your voice small, your work can still echo. You can still leave something that matters. When I stepped off the stage, people clapped. Some stood. But I didn't think about the crowd. I thought about my dad, sitting on a folding chair in Bay 4, scribbling notes on a lunch receipt, wondering if he'd ever get the words right. I think he did. My mum lives 10 minutes from me now. We have dinner every Friday. Her hair's going grey and she's always cold, even in summer. She helps pack hygiene kits for new residents and writes birthday cards by hand for each shelter tenant. She never talks much about the years we lost, but she always asks how I'm doing and waits for a real answer. Jessica and I are still together. She runs communications for a literacy non-profit. We talk about maybe getting a dog. Maybe kids. One night I told her everything. About the letter, the drive, the shelters, the mistakes, the man my father tried to be. She held my hand and said, "You're not just building homes, you're rewriting a legacy. Maybe, or maybe I'm just learning how to carry one properly this time." There's one shelter I never placed in a city lot. It sits in a quiet field behind a community garden in Kansas, surrounded by wildflowers and cottonwoods. I planted it there myself, dug the foundation by hand. There's no resident, no rental paperwork, no power source. It's not for living. It's a monument. On the inside, instead of the standard plate with LP etched in steel, there's something different. A single line, engraved in brass. When you love someone, you leave them something to grow. I visit it once a year, sometimes alone, sometimes with my mum, sometimes with kids from the shelter program who want to know how it all started. I tell them the truth, not the tidy version, the real one. A man who didn't know how to be a father but left behind the tools for his son to become something more, not despite him but because of him.